Today we'll be talking about monopolies, trusts and pools, Chapter 6. By the 1870s, the Standard Oil Company had become a giant in the oil industry. It thought that it could throw its weight around and push out its competition. One thing Rockefeller did was to play the railroad companies against one another. And he would tell them that they would have to do business with him. They would give Standard Oil a rebate, or they would not be allowed to do business with them. And that is that they would have to pay Standard a portion of the freight charges, and they would have to do it secretly. And so everyone else was paying a lot more money. They were paying like 35 cents to transport a barrel of oil, where Rockefeller was only paying about 10 cents. So he was making business easier for his company, making it harder for other companies. And then he grew even bolder. And to keep Standard Oil's business, a railroad now had to pay a rebate on everything that Standard Oil shipped. It also had to give Standard Oil a rebate on everything its competitors shipped. And the railroads gave in to his demands. By 1879, Rockefeller controlled 90% of the refining business in the country, which was practically a monopoly. Nobody else could compete against him. To control the oil industry even further, Standard Oil adopted a new form of organization called a trust. Here's how a trust works. Stockholders of different companies in the same industry, in this case the oil industry, turned their stocks over to a single group of trustees. In return, the stockholders received trust certificates. These certificates entitle them to share in the profits of the trust, but they have no say in how the company will be run. That is left up to the trustees. So using this trust, Standard Oil bought 39 more oil companies that were still in business. So by then, it was able to control almost the entire oil company and business. The trust idea caught on quickly, and soon there were other types of trust. There was the tobacco trust, the leather trust, the sugar trust, and dozens of others. By the 1900s, in fact, 2/3 of all manufactured goods in the United States were produced by just a handful of giant corporations like these trusts. Now, the American consumers started to become a little bit concerned about the size of some of these big businesses. They could see that the large businesses were producing goods at a lower cost, but was it always better for the consumers? Sometimes yes and sometimes no. Even while making large profits, Standard Oil passed on its lower costs to its consumers. So did Andrew Carnegie's steel companies, but other companies did not. In fact, they kept charging high prices even though their production costs had gone down. And they had no competition, so no one could force them to lower their prices. One of the things that Americans were concerned about was that the trusts were going to stop opportunities for others to start their own businesses. Small companies would be forced out of business and no one would be able to enter into that field. The second reason that people were concerned is that they were worried about the influence on local, state, and even national politics. They felt that these people in the large companies would be able to use their money to help elect representatives that would help them in their companies. So these big industries that were starting up created something that the US had had very little of before. They had new millionaires. By the 1900s, there were about more than 4,000 people who were considered millionaires. Andrew Carnegie's total fortune was more than $500 million. Today, that would be around $9 to $10 billion. Rockefeller was also a billionaire. Railroad giant Cornelius Vanderbilt and his son William were not far behind. These people were making a lot of money on America's growth. Now, this period in American history is called the Gilded Age. It was named this by the author Mark Twain, and he called it the Gilded Age because he felt that although things looked good on the surface, big businesses, growing wealth, and many with glitzy lifestyles, underneath there was corruption and suffering. To many Americans, the growing gap between the few wealthy and the millions of middle class or poor was a big problem. Americans might applaud the ambition and talent of these wealthy, but they were worried about those who were less fortunate than them. There was something else that also happened at this time with those who were wealthy. Some of them were giving generously to charities to improve life in America. They would give back. John D. Rockefeller gave millions to create the University of Chicago and to finance medical research. Andrew Carnegie provided money to build free public libraries in hundreds of American towns and cities. But some people felt that they were robbing the poor to give back to the poor and did very little to help the average American. So many Americans thought that there should be a way that the government could help regulate these large and powerful businesses. So they took it to the government to see what they could do. There were three main practices that people were concerned about that the railroad companies were engaging in. The first one was that they were giving rebates to favored shippers, which we already talked about. The second practice that was unfair was called pooling. So from time to time, railroad companies would use the same route and then they would agree to stop competing with one another. And this would push the prices up. They would pledge not to take more than the assigned share, and then the companies would be making the money and the consumers could do very little about it. The third unfair practice was common on routes where there was only a single railroad. Without competition, the railroad would charge an unreasonably high rate. For example, the rates east of Chicago, there was competition, but rates west of Missouri, there was none. East of Chicago, it was 95 cents a mile for a ton of freight. The west of Missouri, it was $4.80, more than 5 times as much, because they had no competition. These three unfair practices were what led to the U.S. government and U.S. Congress attempting to pass laws to help them. In 1887, they started with the Interstate Commerce Act. This law outlawed both railroad pools and rebates. The law also made it illegal to charge more for carrying goods short distances than for long ones on the same route. However, the Interstate Commerce Act did not have enough power to do its job very well, and so the court would often overrule its turnings. The next attempt was in 1890, where Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. This law declared that trusts and other forms of business intended to restrict trade were illegal. But the wording of the act was vague, and corporations soon found a way to get around it. Even when the government did occasionally charge a business with wrongdoing, the courts would usually side with the business. And the big businesses were so powerful that it was able to influence how judges interpreted the law. And the number of trusts and monopolies continued to grow rather than being helped by these new laws.